What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and returning to the podcast is theologian, philosopher, ethicist, and one really cool friend to have, Jacob Erickson. He's a professor at Trinity College Dublin over in Ireland, and they got a brand new degree that they just launched on Theology and Social Justice. And when he was posting about it online, I messaged him because, well, one, if I know plenty of listeners might be interested in getting to spend a year in Ireland doing theology and social justice. But even more interesting to me are how many different schools that are traditional religious or theological schools are pioneering new master's programs that are inherently interdisciplinary. What is the shape of theological education and religious studies and how they're interacting with other disciplines? How has the task of being a theologian today changed and morphed and moved over time from what it was just even when Jacob and I started our own graduate education, let alone a generation before that? This conversation is a ton of fun. We look at just what the nature and task of theology is, how it's changing, what gets us jazzed and excited about it, talk about a host of new and different trajectories that it takes place. And most of all, I get to talk to Jake, who is just quite a bit of fun to talk to. And I'm pumped that he's coming home all the way across the ocean to hang out with everyone at Theology Beer Camp this October in St. Paul, Minnesota. So come one, come all. Theology Beer Camp 2025.com. Get on it. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, returning the podcast. It's Jacob Erickson, though not in person in Scotland this time, using the internet. But nonetheless, it's always great to see your smiling face there, Jake.
It's always good to see you, Trip.
Jake's at Trinity in Ireland, and the city of Dublin, a theologian who works regularly across different disciplines. And so I thought it would be fun to have a conversation with someone all the regular listeners know. He's been on the podcast before, came to camp last year. It's luring him to come back to Theology Beer Camp in his like native area up in Twin Cities this year.
Yep, be there with bells on.
And talk about the changing nature of theological education, both like what it's like for theologians working across disciplines and all this kind of thing, and then how that's changing even the kinds of degrees and what's going on in theological education for prospective students. And part of that, the idea of having this conversation is because at Trinity Dublin, y'all just launched a new master's program, Theology and Social Justice. And, you know, in one sense, you're like, come on, of course we do theology and social justice. Like, didn't the prophets invent that junk? But the program itself is like an example of really transformations that are taking place in theological education in the last 20 years, where theologians have moved from kind of, you know, getting to know another discipline and then engaging in it, but having the actual education process for the students, the actual research projects for scholars being inherently interdisciplinary. It's very similar to the science and religion program in Edinburgh where I was teaching, where, yeah, well, there are those of us that are theologians or philosophers that are in it, but you also have class with physicists and the biologists. And the interdisciplinary work is a collaborative thinking, bringing gifts from different disciplines as opposed to kind of the scholar that goes and learns it and reports on it. And so I wonder, I know, because we're in a similar generation of sorts, like when did you kind of see this transition of theology being kind of confessionally and ecclesiologically grounded with little excursions out beyond the boundary to a whole new kind of synergetic energy when the walls of theology become more porous and we start moving beyond these kind of traditional borders?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, I've always kind of been a liberal arts person, but growing up where I did, you know, what do you do with a religion degree or a theology degree? You become clergy at the time, which was the kind of mode of discernment. But, you know, given where we are at the current moment, we've been thinking a lot here at Trinity about like what what is needed for what is theological education at this moment? What is needed for theological education? What does theological education look like in an Irish setting in the wake of all kinds of violences from the church? And when it's so like, when theology is so overly associated with a certain version of the church. So really, Trinity is it's a research institution, and it's a research institution that has a long colonial history in and of itself, in a kind of Anglican context, in Ireland. And it's a research institution that frequently divvies up what knowledge is via really separate disciplines. Departments are entire schools that run on separate budgets, and never the twain shall meet, until sort of more recently there have been really these things called centers and interdisciplinary modes of thought. And what that meant is that religious studies or theology has been kind of focused on a particular group of people who are interested in theology or interested in church work or interested in what have you. And we've just realized that we're in a different time and place. And my colleagues, Siobhan Garrigan and Kevin Hargaden, who's with the Jesuit Center for Faith and Justice here in Dublin, and Siobhan's a liturgical theologian. Kevin works on ethics and neoliberalism, and I work on climate and queer stuff. And we all just got together and decided, we need a different way of doing things. And we're benefiting from seeing programs like the ones you mentioned, or Vanderbilt and others, thinking about, okay, what does it mean to actually do theology that recognizes theology is interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary at its core, but also something that has real guts to it. And so what that's meant for us is thinking about, what is the program? It's trying to think through what actual social change can emerge with theology in the mix. How is theology haunting all of these discourses? Histories of climate colonialism, histories of economic injustice, histories of sexual injustice. Theology is always kind of in the room, for good and ill. So recognizing that, but then also taking the next step to think about what are the actual praxes and doings and transformations that might happen. So Kevin Hargaden is teaching this class. I think it's going to be really brilliant. It's like critical social analysis for theologians. So they're going to be training them to use like geographical information systems and think about how can theologians use actual like social data to drive policy recommendation, not just simply say we have a moral or theological obligation to support economic justice or gender justice or what have you, but actually come to those conversations with like social data that we can then make sort of really informed recommendations with. So I think that's, where it's a program that's integrating theology and the social sciences in that way. Siobhan Garrigan's going to be teaching her gender and sexuality theology class by thinking through public art in Dublin. So thinking about the way that space, built environment is frequently gendered or constructed with certain kinds of expectations of social roles. And then I'm going to be teaching a class on the climate crisis, of course, because that's what I love to teach, but really thinking through what tools are there to make transformation. And then the class that I'm really excited for, mysticism, politics, and justice, which links a lot of interest of mine, like in apophatic theology, negative theology, and mysticism, but really kind of emerged as a question of like, how do you sustain social justice movements to avoid burnout? Like, what are the moral, spiritual, renewable resources there that folks integrate spirituality and social witness with? And how has negative theology sometimes made interventions in the expectations of what reality is in really powerful ways? So I think, I think what's remarkable about what we're going to do is just that it runs the range from actually thinking very practically to thinking metaphysically, and realizing that all of those components are needed, with the expectation that, coming around to where I began, that, some folks may be going into ministry and may be using this in churches or in religious organizations. But we also wanted to construct a program that was socially just in its outlook, such that we have folks coming from non-traditional paths, like maybe people who aren't interested in being academics, maybe folks who've had a long career in social activism and want to refresh, or maybe folks who have been in business and want to think about how they connect their sense of meaning with what they do, or make interventions in what they do, or just like feel, what does it mean to study in a way that empowers us not to feel disempowered at a moment when we're dealing with a number of polycrises, and recognizing that those polycrises are transdisciplinary themselves, right? Power doesn't simply say, I am this big, it circulates in all of these different ways. And so to pick apart that, you need a kind of manifold intervention. So I'm becoming far more interested in these conversations that aren't simply just trying to do transdisciplinarity, but are recognizing that transdisciplinarity is always in the room already. And what does it mean to teach theology in that space? I was at a conference this past weekend where one of the scientists in the room said, one thing that I've just learned is that everything is theology. And as a theologian, I'm like, yes, exactly. Welcome to the conversation. And also, I have a lot to learn from you, from your science training as well. So we hone those specialties. But I think, maybe just to add one more thing there is to say that I'm really not pessimistic about this, but I'm also really willing to let trying new things fail. Like, I feel like we're in this liminal space where we don't exactly know what theological education is supposed to be. And we're trying out new ways and modes of being, trying to figure out and cultivate possibilities for what it could look like. What are alternative modes that maybe engage the best of what academia can offer, but also don't try to fall into the traps that, getting a university degree is just preparing you to become a better worker in the capitalist machine or something like that, where students are just viewed as products. What does it mean to sort of just risk education differently for the sake of something else?
One of the things that I've been wrestling with is to kind of how to describe the transitions that have taken place that result in all these kind of new forms where both like the theologians themselves are questioning what their task is, along with people within these other academic disciplines all of a sudden like wanting to hang out with you. In my experience talking mostly in science and religion areas with scientists, it's like they run up against this place where they're unreflected upon inheritances, be it their metaphysical commitments, run up against a problem. Say this happened in the big project working on panpsychism and such, where you're having data that don't fit the a priori metaphysical assumptions they just inherited, and they're like, well, WTF, I want to hang out with a philosophical theologian. This might help. Or like when we were at ESAT, the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology, I went out drinking with a couple very prominent, environmental scientists who are like, this is really important. It animates me, and I don't understand why telling people the data just doesn't get people pumped to not kill their grandkids, And y'all know how to do this. Like, and then you start talking to them, and you're like, well, where did this value in you come from? Oh, you might share your story of growing up on a farm, and this kind of thing. So then you find out, oh, well, this individual grew up, just outside of Skye in Scotland and went hiking all the time, or this person was watching is someone that grew up loving fishing in Florida, and the bedding time for the bass started so much earlier and it threw the whole ecosystem off. Or they have these kind of things, and then what's it grounded in? Oftentimes it's their love of creation that's connected to their faith, and they're like, well, why don't other people make these connections? So these different ways that they start coming. So in religious studies or theology, I came up with 3 transitions happened in the last 200 years. I want to see which ones you think are important. So you're going to assess me. So, and they kind of happen in different traditions. So like within philosophy departments, basically there's this shift where the philosopher who's doing religion the analytic tradition broadly has continued this, but they're like the primary object of study is God, right? And does God exist or not? No, the attributes. So you have all these debates, but from basically around Hume on, and especially after Kant, the object of study became something in the phenomenal world, religion. Whether or not there's traction to the concept of religion in ultimacy or God or anything there, you can still, as a philosopher, study religion because it's a real historical phenomena, and you've bracketed, right, the noumenal claim of God, and it's there. And then you get the whole continental side of philosophy, which in the last 30 years returned to thinking about religion in rather profound ways. And the bracketing of truth claims then just became part of doing philosophy of religion if you're a continental philosopher. And that is set up where places you get, right, Bruno Latour's Gifford lectures, right? And then all of a sudden he's engaging environmental science, Gaia, and religion. You get the kind of political philosophers being obsessed with Paul. And you're like, what got an atheist Maoist to write a book on Paul? This. And so that, underneath that energy is this sense that the language we've used in the West to talk about a depth dimension or kind of value-laden part of the world that we share, but is not just us, right? Rejecting that kind of rationalist assumption of sensationalism, is like religion's the language we used for this. And so in philosophy, there's that shift. And I think for those of us that are theologians, you can see that shift playing out in someone like Paul Tillich's work, right, in his theology of culture, that he's giving this, big ground of being, all this whole order and such. But in a sense, he's going like, let us not confuse the contingent set of symbols, rituals, and practices where ultimacy became transparent to you with the complete confines of it. And in fact, to be humans, to be addressed, to ask these questions. And so we need to learn to exegete all cultural texts as if they bear within them the gifted anxiety of one who wrestles with their finitude, meaning, purpose, love, joy, and power. And so then there's this transition that theology is not just a discourse of a tradition in the explanatory way, but the theologian is also an interpreter of cultural traditions, because that's where the dignity of our Imago Dei gets worked out symbolically in narratives and such. And so that theology of culture turn, one trajectory as it is, those of us that are in the process side of life, that you could see how that insight in Tillich has made process become theological. You could see it in the radical theology tradition. You could see it in the way the hermeneutical theologian, someone like Jungel, starts to relate to even like classically Orthodox Lutheran doctrine of justification becomes a site for theology and culture. And then within institutions, I think there's been a shift because of our students and our interlocutors, where think of any div school or seminary now, what percentage of those students are second career, had a previous career, or do not have a collar on their agenda, like a clergy on their agenda, but are showing up to take classes. And then all of a sudden you're trying to squeeze in what half the people are passionate about into a doctrine class. And you go, oh, like, do we as educational institutions want to serve the genuine energy a growing number of people have about wrestling with the sacred and value and keep shoving them into the bonus readings of our classes? Or are we going to create a master's in science and religion, a master's in social justice, thinking of the growth of just masters of arts and theology degrees? To me, it seems that there's like a number of shifts, both like within the academy, like the philosophical shift of religion being a site of reflection, and then the resources of theology become allies for philosophers and such. That shift within theologians to think about word events transcending confessional boundaries, and then the clientele shift of the people that are attracted to the resources of these traditions come with questions that aren't necessarily confessionally bound, but all three of those set up where someone who loves their tradition and could just as well teach all these classes on that, but love their world and want to know how the tradition goes, all of a sudden we get to facilitate a space that is moving across boundaries and being blessed, not just by like reading the scientist or reading a philosopher, or reading this. It's actually like getting to think together with each other. And I think, anyway, those are like the three transitions that kind of came in my mind.
Yeah. 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 I mean, the last one is really interesting to me in some ways because there's a really beautiful naivete that allows for something new. I mean, maybe this is just Cobb's creative transformation happening in a different kind of way, but you can't assume, right, in any theology or religion class that there is a pre-existent facility with a deep knowledge of tradition and of a particular tradition. You can assume that folks have had certain kinds of engagements with X, Y, and Z tradition. And maybe there are some of those that are, say, maybe post-evangelical that have a certain kind of tradition lingering in the background. But I think that the folks who are interested in theological spaces coming at from all of these different disciplines, trainings, life experiences, come to theological discourse with a kind of wonder or naivete that even though the theologian may say, well, no, you should know this about what our discipline did with this thing that you should know more about, there is that possibility in that unknowing that teaches me as a theologian in the classroom, because it gives us permission to go in directions that I hadn't anticipated. And so I'm finding, maybe there's a destabilization in theological education, but there's more so a destabilization of the theologian, right? Like, what is my role here in these particular spaces? And actually, part of that role is just cultivating the possibility of what comes forth from engaging these histories of texts, these conversations about rituals and embodiment and social practices, and just seeing what can emerge without the kind of disciplinary regulation that would have normally been there by maybe like a church organization saying, you have to abide by Augsburg Confession before you can move on in your theological education to become a pastor. And so that there's kind of a delight in that, like that I don't always know the answers of what people are going to say in the classroom. And also I'm really wanting to go with them with those strange answers to see what kind of can emerge. Like it's almost like theology is on a cusp of becoming there. But the other thing I might say is that, we can't, I think, in this underestimate the power of disciplines as colonial imperial practices, right? And so the idea that there are separate disciplines that we scientifically approached is not an old one. It's a pretty recent one. And it was usually put forth as a method of colonial extraction. We're going to study botany so that we can figure out which plants are useful to us. We'll study geology so we can figure out what we can extract. We'll study physics for XYZ. And keeping these things separate is a colonial practice. And I think one thing that I'm really heartened by in the move of some of those philosophers that you've mentioned and even some of the scientists is the recognition that objective science as a discipline, from that kind of sovereign, the scientist as priest, objective priest of their discipline, is breaking down in such a way that they're recognizing that these approaches are colonial constructs of power. And that means then that it moves into these larger questions of love and justice and meaning and abyssal mystery of why we're passionate about these things in the first place. Why did I go study botany? Was there sort of a childlike care of the context in which I grew up in? Oh, wait, are these ethical or theological questions? Oh no, am I a scientist now doing theology? And you kind of hear the movement of it. But I think it's so too reversal that, one mistake that religion and theology has made is trying to move in a self-legitimizing way in the modern research institution to say, oh no, we're just like the sciences. We're a real discipline. We're objective. We study religion in objective ways with distance, with a kind of dispassionate, kind of observant gaze. And it feels like somehow the scientists and some of the philosophers are realizing that that was problematic all along and was never real in the long history of conversation about academics. But it feels like the religionists are still kind of trying to prove themselves as a legitimate discipline in the current moment, which I think is, part of its trauma, given the amount of theology and religious studies departments that are closing. Like, we really do belong here. And then to see all these folks turning to theology and really craving it and needing it and wanting it, you're like, why are you closing all these things when people want this now? But holding on to that sense that theology has a lot invested into it, that it doesn't need to sort of become like another colonial discipline is really important now more than ever, because that openness to alterity, to the divine, to other creatures, to other human beings, to the weirdness of our own flesh, that is what made theology so compelling in the first place. And that investment, that passion in the subject is what's luring people to it now. And so to say, yeah, maybe we're the queen of the sciences, but it's not in the way that you think we are.
There's like an increasing presence of power discourse, but one of the elements that religion adds when reflecting on it, well, on our better days, is like there's a growing awareness that human desire is transforming our planet and needs transformed. And this is like religion's a technology of desire formation, right?
Yes.
And so part of what we bring into lots of interdisciplinary encounters is not just like the concept of desire formation, but the wisdom of traditions that have formed desire historically. We also tend to be the most observant of how we form desire poorly, right? Like if you sit down with a theologian and then like, oh, so you think religion's desire formation? You're like, yeah, let me tell you how we've screwed that up, right? And you're going to give examples that involve ownership. And I think part of it is other disciplines don't see themselves in that discipline grounded in some kind of shared responsibility sense for their past, right? So you don't talk to a scientist and be like, man, not that long ago, y'all were into eugenics.
Yep.
But if they talk to you, they're like, well, Jake, y'all had a bunch of Nazis. And
Yeah.
and we don't go, well, no. We're like, yeah, this is some dangerous junk, don't you think? And the biggest opponent that's, I think, becoming increasingly clear is the larger kind of financialization of existence, the neoliberal logic in the way it flattens or bifurcates reality and then assumes that the containing the right data and reasoning platform will generate the correct answers. And we're just going to keep running up our head against a rather shallow anthropology, one that no wisdom tradition knows how to do, right? Like that's just, you like you're so familiar with human beings because that's what you're working with all the time. There's not like a graph of them or data from an isolated form and this kind of thing. Or even, right, and this is, like if you think of like Hegel making philosophy this like crescendo, oh, religion is great, it's excellent, especially my Lutheran form, but it's picture thinking, right? Well, what's lost when you get rid of the pictures? It all of a sudden, the truth of it becomes that which can be abstracted in a human mind, right? And so the way in which the colonial legacy of Christianity and other traditions have been metabolized by theologians make us much more sensitive to how desire formation happens in this collective way and its negative outputs. And sometimes both the kind of awareness and sensitivity makes us an asset in interdisciplinary conversations where other disciplines haven't cultivated that yet. It reminds me of that line, Catherine, your teacher has, where she's like, what matters most endlessly is what we earth dwellers together embody, not what we say about God, but how we do God. If you're obsessed with theology in a confessional way, you're going to be like, but does that include the hypostatic union? Right? Like if that's what's happening. But once you've made these kinds of transitions from only talking about God in the abstract to the, performance of religion, or from theology in a confessional boundary to taking seriously culture and these kinds of things, then what Catherine's saying is a kind of gift that other disciplines haven't necessarily excavated yet.
Yeah. Or continuing Christologically, like Jesus doesn't say, sorry, you got the generation of the sun wrong, or the hypostatic union
I'm
wrong.
being eternally
Or,
generated.
yeah, no, actually, I was there and you should have fed me. Like, there's these like really basic things that are like far more valuable. And I'll go with the metaphysical like exponent of that every day, but the abstraction is never without need to be that kind of grounded ness. Well, I mean, you could think about it in this way, right? So if the sciences, if theologies are embodied practices, you could use the example of botany, or you could use the example of zoology, and the embodied practice of passionately studying a flower or an animal. And the way that that plots itself out in the history of science is, right, embodied observation. In plants, it's morphology, and zoology gets into more biology and anatomy. But the scientist is configured with this kind of embodied ritual of observation, of usually trying to capture a perfect formal version of the plant, those plant specimens, or in even worse moments, the history of, say, vivisection in the study of animals, like dissecting animals while they're alive to see how they work, because they're really only just machines. They don't, matter ultimately. Those are formations of desire, right? They're formations of desire to understand. They're formations of embodied desire of how I relate to another creature and how another creature relates to me. They're formations of embodied desire with what I understand livingness or a soul or a spirit to be. And they're imperial extractivist visions, right? So all of that is fomenting desire. And if you approach theology that way, which many systematic theologians do, you end up taxidermying God. And there's an important, need to think precisely. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that. But if theology allows us to go back to look at those formations of embodied desire and say, you know what, there was a malformation of respect or of cherishing the interrelationship of these fellow creatures, or even you just got the sense you totally misunderstood what a plant was, or even if you misfelt what a plant is or what another animal is, that sense of mutual feeling and embodied desire then gets disrupted. And science hasn't always had, like you're saying, like, and some theologies haven't had the understanding enough to go back and say, wait a minute here. And maybe because of the catastrophes that theology has endured and caused, and some of the ways that prophetic and socially just Christianities, and I don't want to give them a redemption narrative either, but the naming of suffering that liberation theologies have taken on, make theology as a mode of repentance or redirection or an interruption of injustice something that theology might have to offer back to the sciences again, or back to itself again as self-critique, or like just to say that, what is self-critique in any discipline look like that is not just about intellectual advancement, but is about, say, repentance. Can AI repent if it gives you bad information, or if it uses all the water that it uses? So I think theology has something to learn about the importance of processes of trust and understanding there too from the sciences. Maybe or maybe a more fundamental question that both of them just need to ask is, what does wonder look like under the conditions of power? Is probably the most precise question that one needs to ask. If you pull up Socratic moment and say that all wisdom begins in wonder, and if we are saying that the sciences tend to approach scientific thinking by wondering at the natural world, or that theology opens itself to meeting in the abyssal sense of wonder of the divine or ultimate concern, and that those two overlay each other in a variety of different ways, then, where is wonder being formed in a violent way. It allows us to pay attention more to the ordinary movements of thinking rather than focusing on the exceptional moments of crisis, which I think, we are dealing with right now, right? The deployment of crisis language as an extractivist tool. Oh, we're in a crisis. We need to change XYZ. Kyle White's really important piece against crisis epistemology is what I always think about in current moments, working in Native American studies, about the ways that the language of crisis was used as a justification for the establishment of residential schools or the destruction of indigenous cultures, right? They're in a crisis, they don't know, and therefore we need to educate them, that white colonial mentality. And I think, crisis capitalism right now is probably something that is being deployed as a way of using violent formations of wonder to take more power on the part of multimillionaires, billionaires.
But and under that, right, what is the demand any form of knowledge makes upon you?
Yeah.
And so, like, even the example you gave, right, of dissecting something, be it God or a bunny, like if you have precise carcass of a bunny or God lined out and labeled, that is very small portion of what it means for a bunny to, in its bunniness, or the divine in its becoming.
Yeah.
And yet that kind of knowledge, that kind of like flattened or abridged book of nature of sorts, is what is at the heart of so much of kind of the neoliberal knowledge regime. And so there's this epistemology of distance that becomes normative. And in that distance, it renders nature, natural resources, it renders people, neighbors, human resources. And the imperative or the demand are the market incentives, the shareholders, these kinds of things, for an always accelerating growth demanded pressure. And I think that one of the things that, surprisingly shows up in a lot of interdisciplinary conversations are the limits of a distanced epistemology. That's how you do science, but if that is the only data in which you make decisions out of, you're missing like an engaged one. And that's one of the unique features of the wisdom within any religious tradition. A religious tradition is not something you understand prior to being formed by it. It would be like asking someone to marry you and promise this life of love and fidelity on the first date. People are going to look at you like, WTF, right? And faith, like love, is something you must know the meaning of before you can say yes. There's like you can't like claim it all. You learn it in the process. And those kinds of truths are made manifest against a background of commitment, engagement, emotional involvement. Yet Martha Nussbaum uses that image of like porous knowledge,
Yes.
and because it's entailed in love. And I think that is, I mean, even your example earlier, right? Like where Jesus goes, like, what you've done to the least of these, or like, who is my family? It's the ones that know and do the will of the Father, right? There's a kind of wisdom and wonder in a religious sense that can't differentiate knowledge from wisdom, and wisdom is knowledge that comes with a demand. There's a line when I was editing the book of John Cobb's like writings across his life that came out last year. One of the lines that I found and was like, oh, that is the most John Cobb for Methodist ways of explaining the piety of a process thinker. He said, "The world seen as creation compels me to acknowledge that I myself am the work of God, not of myself or of blind forces or necessity. God's purpose brought me into being and rightfully places a demand upon me." And that transition of knowledge into wisdom is that shrinking of the epistemological gap from distancing, to enactment or engagement or embodiment. In so many of the interdisciplinary conversations, you can see a yearning for that transition in other disciplines, and that being one of the greatest gifts religious studies scholars bring is, oh no, that's what turns us on. Like, we're really pumped about that.
No, I mean that's that. I mean, I was thinking, while you were saying that earlier too, and then you made the move that the distinction between wisdom and knowledge, right? And I like this sense that wisdom has an element of responsibility to it, and that I always think of wisdom in the sense that wisdom always involves being in placed. It always involves a kind of, it sits in places, sort of Proverbs kind of moment. It matters for a particular context, and it also matters for a particular time, right? Knowledge becomes wisdom when it's responsible, when it pays attention, and when it acts within a sense of time and place, which is less about keeping the mechanics of a note and more about, for the choir nerds, like that moment of singing a fermata, like that's when wisdom happens. But I think one of the differences that in the modern knowledge regime, right, is that the assumption that knowledge is timeless goes along with this kind of capitalist construction of power, that we're just accumulating facts and data that will always be true in all places and in all times. And in order to live out that life, it needs to be enforced in all places and at all times. Whereas wisdom recognizes that there's a sense of what the geologist Marcia Bjornerud, I think it is, calls timefulness, right? That it's about a timeful sense of our sense of bodies in time, in organic history, in context, in the context of histories of power. So then knowledge becomes not just about those timeless facts, but becomes something more delicate and precise, perhaps, or at least attentive. And in its attentiveness, then it needs a reshift of what we understand knowledge as in terms of intelligence. What is knowledge? Knowledge is not just the sort of rational epistemological ways. And sometimes this is how even theology chooses to disrupt power regimes, is saying, oh, Western epistemology functions in this particular rationalistic way, and therefore we need to transform that rationalistic mode into a different way of power analysis, which then sort of sometimes replicates the kind of rationalisms that is present. But if knowledge is about bodies, if it's about intelligence in broader and more capacious ways, that means it's about the porosity of our organic bodies. It's about our sense of felt emotion. It's about knowledge as the kinds of stories that I have been told that I also pass down. So knowledge as tradition, right? And this is, you can see, like, maybe there's the Wesleyan quadrilateral popping in where you're like, oh wait, actually, reason and emotion and human sciences and tradition, and scriptural imagination, all of those things become elements of intelligence that are figured and refigured for the sake of discernment in wisdom. And all of those things are, at least in theology, are about discerning movements of the spirit. Right. So then there's actually just this other responsibility, which is sometimes figured as the doingness of God, and embodying God, as you sort of alluded to, Catherine, there. So I've been working on a lot of plant studies stuff lately. I was telling you earlier, and the new sciences around this questions of plant intelligence have me thinking about actually this precisely in knowledge and wisdom. Like this question: are plants intelligent? Well, some folks are saying, yeah, the whole plant functions like a brain. Some folks say, yeah, plants are sentient and persons and have a certain kind of consciousness. Some folks are saying, actually, intelligence is a kind of loose moniker, but when you begin looking at the aesthetic choices that plants are making, both visible and invisible to the human, the kind of chemical forms of communications that plants make across species and within species, and the kinds of dispositions that individual plants have, there's a sense that actually, if that's intelligence in a certain way, our sense of human intelligence has not only been narrow for the human, meaning our sense of what knowledge is has not only been narrow for the human, but it's just narrow planetarily. I was at a talk the other day where another scholar was talking about the birds who mimic various different sounds that they hear. So some of them are like human loggers or like car alarms going off. And we're discussing that bird song as an archive of historical knowledge, because can get a sense that the bird somehow in its history and its embodied way of knowing the world encountered this other creature, and because it's mimicking it. Now, how else would it have known, right? And in some species, that bird song or that bird mimicry can degrade over time. Some birds slowly forget. So you can actually kind of get a sense of like how long ago some birds encountered that thing. And I was just thinking, like, if if theological education, just circling back around in a funny way, if theological education has solely focused on, or any disciplinary production of knowledge has solely focused on the rational production of knowledge in the human, how small is that for the human? How wrapped up in power is that for the human? And how much bigger is the world and the ways that the world communicates and interacts in its own multiplicity that, kind of overwhelms me. It's like, what does wisdom look like in that moment? Right. And it's wondrous to me. And it's also deeply humbling to humiliating. Like, am I going to go outside and am I going to interact with all these creatures in an appropriate way at this particular moment in time? No, I'm not. I'm an animal body. It's weird. But if I'm tuned to a sense of wisdom, and if I'm empowered by these traditions for discerning and at least being open to the ways that my body interacts with the world and is being interacted with, or is even being composed by the world in these ways, maybe I approach walking down the street a little bit differently. We're going to have a moment where you have a kingdom of God moment, and Jesus is like, and I'm like, where were you? And he was like, well, you went by this plant and you didn't water it. It was like, so we're, like how
You got a sequel to
freaking-
Elizabeth Johnson's Ask the Beast is Ask the Fun Guy.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Just, I mean, bodies decompose and do their interactive symbiotic thing. And wisdom is not about making that into a false harmony either, right? That's, I think, what a lot of early engagements with ecological metaphor sometimes did, was they flattened out the complex intensities of the world sometimes, and lost the whole life is robbery thing. Like, my body will be feed for something else someday. Really happy about that. That's a kind of odd immortality in process. But that's, yeah, the fungal is, I was thinking about, can I go on a tangent a little bit? Another tangent?
Tangent away.
I was thinking the other day about what it would look like to reimagine Christology in light of fungal metaphors. And I'm sure other folks have done this as well. But just to think about, if Jesus is talking about yeast and that kind of like slow burn, what would it mean to think about like Holy Saturday, for instance, as a mycorrhizal embedding of Christ in the world in a fungal way, or resurrection as a kind of fungal rather than a redemptive kind of mode? That there's something really interesting there that needs to be done. If bread for the world is to emerge, you need a bit of fungus, a little bit of mold.
Well, there's enough parables that you could take kingdom parables and then use those as the key for interpreting the reality of the kingdom after the resurrection.
I mean, you don't, right? Without various versions of fungi, you don't get bread, you don't get wine, you don't get X, Y, and Z. And so suddenly all of those Christological metaphors don't happen. It's like talking about the birds and the bees as love. And then you realize, wait a minute, if colony collapse disorder is the thing, what do our metaphors of love mean?
hmm Maybe say a bit about the event. I mean, you've kind of like mentioned it aside, but how did the kind of interdisciplinary gathering you were at in Harvard, and I know you mentioned Merlin Sheldrake was there, who's been on the podcast before, where people could hear that conversation just to get an idea of how his particular work on fungi connected to larger process stuff. But if you think of like that event and the kinds of questions and what it represents within kind of the changing space of theology within the academy, what particular parts of it would you kind of like bring up or go, oh, here's a little post or something like that of where things are going?
Yeah, yeah. So I was at I think it was the Thinking with Plants and Fungi initiative at Harvard Divinity School. Massive shout out to Rachel Peterson, who ran that brilliantly. And it was a lot of botanists, plant scientists, Merlin Sheldrake, Juliana Furci for fungus folks. And it was important to name the plants and fungi. Juliana has this proposal for, it's not correct in terms of Latin, but the three worlds of flora, fauna, and funga, which I find really interesting, them naming the distinctiveness of that. There were a number of other writers. Zoe Schlanger, who wrote The Light Eaters about plant intelligence, talked to a few other scientists who work on things like plant intelligence and, that some were calling furtively plant neurobiology, which is an interesting, just interscience disciplinarity of its own. I've gotten interested in plant studies a lot more. I've always had kind of a long interest in it, but I participated a number of years ago in a gathering in Bristol with a bunch of plant philosophers thinking about, we've got all these folks who've been brilliantly focused on animals and environmental justice issues, but plants always kind of suffer from a kind of backgrounding, or the phrase is plant blindness, that we sort of don't really observe or take them into account because we tend to focus on charismatic animals. Or is there a kind of latent sense of human centrism there, right? That we want to, we only really care about humans, but all these animals are kind of like us. So therefore we kind of move there, and plants kind of in their massive diversity and in their care only really enter into our vision when we feel that we can use them for medicines or for beautifying the garden or something like that, or food. So there's a use there. But the gathering was interesting because it was really trying to think about, what's happening right now in plant sciences, particularly. There's this kind of new sense that, plants are doing all of these things that we just really had no idea of. They're functioning in a variety of ways. They're communicating. A public interest in plants is growing with a number of these popular books using plants as metaphors for ethic. And I've gotten interested in these people who I think in history who have maybe engaged with something in plant sciences and have ended up in theology somehow. So I was giving a paper on this early 20th century Cambridge botanist, or botanist based in Cambridge. She really never had much institutional support, a botanist by the name of Agnes Arber, of all things. And she wrote these really amazing texts on like plant morphology, which is what botany used to be before the plant sciences kind of took over and thinking about all of the different scientific ways. But plant morphology, looking at the different forms and engagements of plants. And she wrote about everything from herbals to grains to these plants called mycologists. And then kind of had this interruption where she lost her laboratory space, and during the course of World War II, especially, didn't have access to specimens as much and turned to plant philosophy. And it's kind of really sort of one of the texts that's being recovered as kind of an origin of plant philosophy besides Theophrastus, and a natural philosophy of plant form is the book. But she writes these, she makes this philosophical turn partway through her career, writes two books on kind of plant philosophy, and a book called The Mind and the Eye, which is about how biologists see and imagine and picture the world. And then the final book of her life, she writes, it's a book called The Manifold and the One, which is, it's, it doesn't appear to be any botany in it, any plants in it. She's just writing about mystics and negative theologians in a bunch of different traditions in history. So Nicholas of Cusa to Sufis to the Bhagavad Gita to it's just it's a wild book. It's a book that grows wild out of her sense of wonder for the world. And the botanist plant scientist community were like, what do we do with this? And all of her books prior to that, and this is 1957, all of her books prior to that had been published by Cambridge University Press. They wouldn't publish this one. This one's published, and it goes out with John Murray and then gets picked up by the Theosophical Society. Howard Thurman cites it at one point. And what's remarkable about it is that when you dive into it, she begins to describe mystical theological concepts, the coincidence of contraries, that two things that seemingly opposite can appear simultaneously, or the fact that the world is multiplicity and unity simultaneously. She begins to unpack these metaphysical concepts using kind of plant metaphors. She's like, oh yeah, we can describe these two kinds of flowers, but really those two laws don't always hold true, and sometimes they occur together. And we can't approach our way of thinking in a neat and linear and logical fashion. We have to approach it. And she uses the word reticulate, which is like a honeycomb structure. It's a honeycomb epistemology. But also reticulate structures are formed or happen within plant cells. So you get an image of multiplicity and unity simultaneously. And so with that, she basically, her version of reality begins to look like this folding and unfolding of a plant world. And I think what's remarkable to me in that, and why I'm interested in this conversation that happened at Harvard, was that, sometimes the ways that people are passionate, as you were saying, like passionate about the world and the way that they cultivate the desire in their own ways. And for her, as a botanist, observing these plants with a kind of intensity in the midst of her own, and then taking that in a metaphysical direction and seeing reality kind of flowing and inflowing in that. She didn't really, or should I say, she let her wonder and her approach to botany unfold in a way that wasn't restricted by disciplinary bounds. And the disciplinary bounds were sort of foisted upon her. She recognized certain practices as scientific practices and others as metaphysical practices. But I think because she didn't really have much institutional support, she worked in a lab that she set up in her home and raised for her daughter alone after the death of her husband. It's very similar to the Lessons in Chemistry book by Bonnie Garmus, actually, in some ways. But I think because she just was able to do what she did, she took it to her own logical metaphysical conclusions. And I'm really amazed at that, because it means that sometimes disciplines become disciplinary or kind of hold a kind of discipline of power that tells people, no, you can't reflect on meaning.
Yeah.
And what's remarkable to all these plant scientist folks for me is that they're thinking about how these figures of, say, like entanglement or symbiosis, or histories of cultural engagement with plants, or plants as religious ritual, or even, psychedelic plants as a kind of invocation of a mystical or religious experience, or plants as other persons or beings in indigenous cosmologies. That there's a sense in which plant studies people are kind of entertaining these conversations in ways that aren't restricted by a kind of disciplinary apparatus. And it's happening in a divinity school precisely because it can happen outside of that disciplinary apparatus. And that means it's kind of awkward. It feels sometimes like we've all shown up to a prom and nobody knows who to dance with yet. And we're trying to, figure out where are the conversations, where are the questions even, and how can we learn And with what words can we even use to speak about plant life in its alterity and in its difference? And that kind of impulse is like, how do I talk about plant life in its mystery to me, knowing that we're learning more in a kind of learned ignorance way? We know a lot more about what we don't know now. And that's like, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's how theologians approach God. All these folks are beginning to run up against the edges of what we can say and understand about plant life and have intuitions about what might be there, but don't quite know for sure in terms of scientifically verifiable evidence in that way. So the process is interesting in a conversation. Yeah. Yeah. It's I wish more institutions, religious and not, would be willing to foster the risk of those kinds of conversations, because they feel so much more politically important now. When the validity or questions of like the value of academia or of higher education are, when that's being wielded by a current political and power structure, being willing to take the risk of what does it look like to produce and engage and think on the edges of what we know and what we don't know and what all of us know differently is such a gift. And it does something. It creates energy. It creates movement. It creates resistance of a kind of way to say, no, we don't need to. Sometimes the process of education or knowledge doesn't need a commodifiable object to come out of it immediately. I don't need to prove that this was valuable to you. And sometimes that's how I feel about like faith and theology as well, right? Like faith, as in my, occasionally narrow Protestant way of understanding it, does not need to be demonstratable as a kind of value. I think it needs to have the best of theological reflection and metaphysical speculation and philosophical coherence. I want that for my own theology, but I don't need to prove to X person that it's valuable. Maybe that's also like a little bit of the queerness in me as well. Like, I don't need you to accept me. I'm just going to live my life. Thank you.
I find I'm interested in listeners how clear it is, but like just in focusing on that one kind of interdisciplinary space, you see how there's a different kind of energy that shows up when you mentioned earlier the Wesleyan quadrilateral, like in one sense that the function of experience. There's, for most theologians, there's like the recognition that one's own experience is playing a part in it as a source of it. There's the kind of liberative expansion, right, of the experience of other people being a site for theological reflection. And here, like the experience of other creatures being a site for theological reflection. All that is going on, and that's just thinking about, hanging out with plants and fungus. It reminds me, or it's similar to that parallel shift that happens in anthropology, like once it has the ontological turn, where you realize like even the patterns of receiving the world and knowing it and interpreting it that we treat as normative for us, like we've actually, in making children literate, we've hijacked their brain structure to interpret reality different than all of us as a species before we were literate. And it just takes paying attention to how human beings read the world before there was a word like reading, before to go, and then go, that's actually like way closer to how the people of faith whose testimony is treasured in the Hebrew scriptures and Christian scriptures engage and read the world. Very few of them are literate, let alone lived in a world where texts are plastered everywhere and all this other kind of thing. Like there's this, the feeling for those of us that are so Protestant to expand our hermeneutical horizon, expand those experiences with that kind of contain the dignity as a site of theological reflection stuff. It just seems so foreign, but that foreignness is very much a product of the word-based religion moving from spoken to written to then parsed and translated and compiled. And so there's this whole little side effect thing for me of going back to this kind of originary Protestant insight, right? Like that the gospel actually precedes scripture, and the canonization, the text, and our creeds, all these kinds of things are referential to this event that has so seized us that we bear witness to it. And yet that seizing has been flattened to a whole form of knowing that's shaped by a kind of Western modern mind that there are layers, theologically speaking, to the gospel or word event that are opened back up when we learn to read and to hear and to see, like with someone who's treasured how forests think or how fungi communicate. And it's actually a way for Protestants in this kind of like post-written word space to take again seriously the initial Protestant impulse that the gospel actually precedes the written word, as much as we trust it to be a faithful witness to the Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. And that really in the wake of that, about we're playing, like it's all about like the playfulness of taking risks of learning together in that kind of, in the wake of something that has that kind of effect. And that means that we can play with tech. We can even do like play a language and text, but playing with others whose ways of knowing the world are different and engaging and in highly ethical ways, I think too, are the ways that we kind of grow and learn and move. And I think that's one thing that I'm always enjoying in transdisciplinary things that are labeled transdisciplinarity is the playfulness of learning happens there. Because as one of the participants in the conference has said to me, she's like, yeah, when you look around, you can be like, yeah, they're plant people. Like, and that sense of which, like, oh wait, you and I share something. We have completely. You may have you're formed as a biologist with a very specific scientific training. I'm formed as a theologian with a very specific sense of training, and yet we clearly share something unknown in the way that we see the world, and that playfulness of getting to have that conversation and seeing the ways that maybe our academic ways of knowing come together, but also playing with these more than human ways of knowing that come together, and then seeing what can kind of maybe emerge, that's deeply meaningful to me. It's actually, it's empowering to me. Like, it doesn't make me feel like I'm trying to mold my theological imagination in the service of a kind of institutionalization for a specific purpose. It actually feels like I'm thinking about, what does community look like? What is engagement with the world look like, such that new possibilities can emerge? And that, so if it's play on one hand, it's also attention to possibility. And maybe that's the other thing that I'm learning from these plant science folks, and especially, about like the metaphor of entanglement. A lot of people mishear the metaphor of entanglement as it's being used by biologists or physicists as harmony, as a kind of flat nature harmony, that we're just sort of like entangled together. Oh, look how wonderful. We're all entangled. Relationships, beautiful. But I think like entanglement entails two things, right? One, that we're entangled together in the fullness of the beauty of what creaturely possibility is and the violence of what creaturely possibility is. But entanglement is less about the givenness and more about possibilities too, right? It's about the playful ways that we hone our attention to what might be possible. I'm entangled in these relations such that this might emerge, or I'm asking this question in this way such that this might respond to me differently. And so that highly ethical play and paying attention to possibility means that in those spaces, I'm not expecting a utopian community to kind of suddenly emerge. Like I'm under no delusion that my asking the question in this way will result in a perfect moral or ethical kind of way of seeing the world, or of encountering other creatures, or even encountering my disciplinary others. But it does mean that I'm always paying attention to the ways that things might be different, or things could have been different. And I think that that's where the wonder disrupts into the possibility of ethical interruption. And that's a better way of articulating it from maybe even a non-religious side, to say that actually my paying attention to possibility allows me to embody possibility differently and together. And so if we're getting those metaphors of entanglement, or of relations, or of, plant subjectivity, or intelligence, or communication, that means that I can, really run with it in reimagining, how I know the world, how I engage with others, but also how I can completely reimagine what a program theology needs to be. That I don't need to do my class on Christology in this way. I can do it in a different way, and see what kind of can emerge, and in paying attention to possibility. So if it's play and possibility, then finally it's the possibility that I can be interrupted, right? That my own agency in paying attention to possibilities might mean that the way I've been asking the question, or the way that I've been embodying my own disciplinary approaches to the world, is fundamentally destruction, or it can be destroying of others' possibilities, or of other relationalities. So I think that lack of inevitability, that things will just turn out all right, means that there's my Lutheranism again. If I'm paying attention to possibility, it means that I'm getting things right and wrong all the time, and constantly renegotiating myself, but hopefully discerning a sense of wonder and responsibility, wisdom, as we were saying, what might come next. I think that's maybe where to go with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, this has been a lot of fun. I want to make sure you tell everyone where to go find y'all, connect with you at Trinity Dublin and learn more about the new Theology and Social Justice Master's program and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So the program is a master's in philosophy in theology and social justice. It runs at Trinity College Dublin. It's launching next academic year, so 2025, 2026. If you go to tcd.ie/religion, it'll lead you to the religious. If you click through to the religious studies and the courses, you'll find the course there.
And I can link to it directly in
the
post
that'd be great. That'd be great. There's some funky videos of Kevin and Siobhan and myself talking about what we're doing and how we're teaching our classrooms differently because of that. But just to say that I'm deeply, deeply, deeply lucky to be teaching this with Siobhan Garrigan and Kevin Hargaden. I mean, I would do the course solely to take classes with them, just to put it that way.
Yeah.
And it's just remarkable. So,
and what's the kind of like format for this degree in general? Like, is it residential, online, mix of it? Like,
yeah, so it is residential in Dublin. So international folks applying early for the visa matters. But there are 3 core modules. So the core modules are My Theologies for the Climate Crisis. Modules are what we call classes.
Yeah.
Theologies for the Climate Crisis, Kevin Hargaden's Power and Empowerment. And then Siobhan Garrigan teaches a class on theological ideas of homelessness, home, and race. So thinking about the context in Ireland here. And then the students choose 3 elective modules over the course. So it's a 1-year program. Everyone does those 3 core modules. They choose 3 other modules from economic justice and theological reflection, my mysticism, politics, and justice, critical social analysis for theologians, and gender and sexuality justice. And then there is a 12,000 word dissertation on subject of choice. And hopefully those are, we're hoping that those kind of work themselves into transdisciplinary and different ways, like into policy proposals and to your critical engagement with major issues of the time. So it's all in person, and we're taking we've limited the course intake at 15. So we're trying to keep the conversations as like a really intense community thing. And they'll be deeply engaged. So Siobhan's theologies of homelessness folks will be affiliating with activist organizations, homelessness service organizations, mental health organizations in Dublin while they're doing theological reflection. So there's a lot of doing theology with people, I think.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
I can see why you're excited. If you even Jake off of a microphone likes his colleagues, so then getting to do something like this with them, it's I can see why it's energizing. Kind of jealous, but and maybe the likelihood that there are some people in America that might currently find it nice to leave for a limited period of time.
Is a really great place to be in the world right now, and a place with a lot of brilliant conversations that involve a lot of moral clarity that is refreshing.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you, Jake, and I look forward to seeing you in person at camp and talking to you again. So,
absolutely, be in October, if not sooner.